right, to speak to us a little bit more on that, I'm now joined by the professor at the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, Ireland, where he lectures on post-Soviet politics, and that's Donacha O'Bachain. Thank you so much indeed, Prof, for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, so so much to unpack here, but I want to start actually inside Ukraine. And it seems as if Kyiv has given up Mariupol. What does that mean, do you think, in this war?
Well, it's the first, I guess, major city. I mean, Mariupol was about 400, 500,000 people before the war began. Now it's reduced to less than 100,000 people, but it's the first major city that Russia has acquired in this war. But it's a rather Pyrrhic victory because, as I said, there's virtually nobody living there anymore. About 90% of the buildings have been damaged or destroyed in Mariupol. So this is a phantom city, it's a ghost town, and you know, they're destroying a city in order to save it, because of course, as you remember, the official Kremlin narrative is that they're liberating these territories, but of course they're liberating these territories against the will of the people who actually live there, which is a strange kind of liberation, I think you'll admit.
And as this is happening, Finland and NATO, Moscow has already warned that this is a grave mistake and that they will take action. Can they take action given the response they got over Ukraine?
I don't think that they will take action. There's been mixed signals from Moscow on this. On the one hand, they're threatening very, ill-defined retribution. On the other hand, they're saying that, no action might be taken if, for example, NATO troops are not stationed in Finland and Sweden, or if missiles are not stationed there. I think we have to stress how important this is historically. Sweden has been neutral for 2 centuries. You have to go back to the time of Napoleon when Sweden was militarily aligned. Finland has been neutral since the Second World War. So the fact that these countries have abandoned their position of militarily being non-aligned is hugely important in European security. And it shows you the counterproductive nature of Putin's war in Ukraine, because as you remember, the official reason that Putin gave, or one of the many official reasons, was that he wanted to stop what he called NATO expansion into his neighborhood. And now with Finland and Sweden joining, you're going to have the NATO border with Russia doubling in size. I mean, Finland shares a border with Russia 1,300 kilometers. And they share not only, of course, geography, but they share a history, a very complicated history, because Russia, as it was the Soviet Union then, invaded Finland in 1939. But the Finns have, despite being a very small nation, 5 million people, about the same size as Ireland, they put up a heroic defense in that struggle. And it means that even though they have been neutral and militarily non-aligned, they have a huge army. As I said, they're 5 million people, but they have a military resource of about 900,000 men. They have military conscription. But now that is considered not enough to protect them in the wake of the war against Ukraine. That's changed everything, and everybody is reappraising their situation. So Sweden and Finland are going to join NATO. Ireland, from where I'm speaking, is going to be one of the very few countries left in Europe that's a member of the European Union and not a member of NATO. But of course, we're on the opposite side of Europe. You couldn't be further away from Russia in Europe as I am here in Dublin, and that's one of the reasons why, even though we are debating what neutrality means in Ireland, there's no debate really here about joining NATO in the near future. But in Sweden and Finland, being neighbours of Russia, it's a very different story.
So is there a genuine security threat for these 2 countries, given what's happened in Ukraine? Or they have been thinking about it for a long time, and this has come as an opportunity to do something they might have desired anyway?
Well, there were always people in Finland and Sweden who thought it might be a good idea to join NATO, but they were never an overwhelming majority. There was never a consensus in society that this was the right thing to do. But in the Finnish parliament this week, actually it was today that they voted, it was 188, I think, to 8. It was an overwhelming majority in the Finnish parliament. So that kind of division, they weren't willing to make a move into NATO if there was a division in society on the issue. But now there's a consensus that this is the right thing to do. And whether it's in their interest, well, of course, they will have looked at, for example, the differing fates of Estonia and Ukraine. Ukraine is a country of 44 million people. It was not a member of NATO. It was invaded by Russia. Estonia, which has very close cultural ties with Finland, Finnish and Estonian would be related languages. Estonia has a population of just over 1 million people. It's smaller than the population of Dublin, from where I speak now. And yet it has not been invaded, despite being occupied in the past, because it is a member of NATO. So Finland and Sweden would have looked at those contrasting stories, Ukraine versus Estonia, and said, well, look, we are also small nations, Finland 5 million, Sweden 10. We are stronger together. We need security guarantees. And as I said, that's why this war has been so counterproductive on so many levels for Vladimir Putin. Even the fact that he hasn't been able to capture the capital, Kiev, his forces have withdrawn from around Kharkiv. You did mention Mariupol. That's the solitary, really, victory that he has to come out of this, but as I said, it's a Pyrrhic one. But in so many respects, in uniting Europe against Russia, which, by the way, is a rather small economy, I think it's often underestimated, this important point. We often look at Russia almost as if it's a superpower because of the size of its army. But economically, it's not that great a power. Its economy is more or less the size of Italy or France. So it's by uniting Europe and indeed the West against Russia, I think this has been very counterproductive. And NATO membership for Finland and Sweden, I think, is part of that.
And what does this mean for NATO to have these 2 new members and 1,300 kilometers on the Russian border?
Well, I think it's symbolically important for NATO. I mean, NATO, we hear this term a lot in the Russian narrative of NATO expansion, and I think it's part of the, you might say, the fairy stories that come out of the Kremlin. This isn't about any organization expanding. NATO is 30 members now. It soon will be 32 members. And most of those members will have joined since the end of the Cold War. These are sovereign democracies who are independently choosing a path, determining what is in their best interests in terms of securing themselves. And they've all come to more or less the same conclusion that the only military threat, the only security threat of any substance that they face is from Russia. That's why most of those countries that have joined since the collapse of the Cold War have been previously part of Moscow's sphere of influence. They're all in Central and Eastern Europe, more or less. So again, it comes back to this, mistake. Rather than trying to engage with these countries, the Kremlin has frightened them, and that has made NATO stronger. After the collapse of the Cold War, there were many people in Europe who wondered, did NATO have a purpose? Because it was established to contain the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, people said, well, why is it continuing? Why does it continue to exist? But it was Russia's resurgence, particularly under Vladimir Putin, which gave NATO a new reason to be. And this war in Ukraine, as I said, only reinforces that.
All right, Turkey is another name in the mix here, right from the beginning, and it's coming up again with this issue of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Is this something that Turkey will bless or will resist, and does it matter?
I think it won't bless them, but it won't block them either. And that's all that matters. You're hearing, I think, a lot of noises from Ankara right now, frustrations, because there's a lot of built-up frustration in Turkey. Turkey doesn't feel that it gets sufficient respect, sufficient solidarity from other countries in Europe, from NATO allies. So, for example, the United States wouldn't sell Turkey F-16 fighters. Sweden, for example, won't extradite Kurdish separatists who have got political exile and refugee status in Sweden. So there's a lot of letting off steam. But whether it will mean that Turkey would go so far as to block Finland and Sweden joining, I don't think so, and most of the NATO and European Union countries don't think so. The Foreign Minister of Turkey is in the United States today. You're going to have, a frank exchange of views, of course, in Washington, D.C., but I think that Turkey will evaluate the options, and I think it won't see it as in Turkey's interest to block two sovereign countries from joining what is a very heterogeneous alliance. So I think what we're seeing here is Turkey perhaps trying to extract some leverage, some bargaining power out of this, but I don't think it'll actually bring it down to a veto.
So all 30 members of NATO must say yes. So you're saying that Turkey won't be a problem and that these two countries will get a green light, no doubt.
I think so. That's the general consensus within Europe and within the United States. And as I said, it sounds like a simple process, getting the green light, but you can't overestimate the historic significance of these two countries, which are long-time neutrals, joining a military alliance in Europe. But really, Europe has transformed and has changed, I think, in a way that we still haven't fully digested because of this war, which is still only 85 days old. This is a relatively new conflict, but it has transformed the security architecture in Europe.
Sweden doesn't have a border with Russia. So what threat would they be facing? What is this about to move away from this neutrality that they could have continued to enjoy for another 100 years?
Well, Sweden, of course, it's a Baltic state in the sense that its territory goes into the Baltic Sea, and of course Russia shares that sea. You have not only the Russian Federation, the main territory, but you also have Kaliningrad, which is neighboring Poland and Lithuania. So it's also an act of solidarity with Finland. Finland and Sweden do a lot of things together. You might say they're best friends in the neighborhood, within the region. So they've coordinated this membership action plan, because then if Sweden hadn't joined as well, it would have been more or less surrounded by NATO members. Norway, Denmark, all the other Nordic countries would have been members. So the Nordic group they have a strong degree of cohesion. They already cooperate a lot militarily with NATO. So this, for Swedish people anyway, seems to have been a logical debate, but it would never have come to fruition. I mean, you asked earlier, and it's a great question, whether this was something that people were pushing for already, or whether it happened only because of this conflict. I think it wouldn't have happened were it not for this conflict, even though there were voices within Sweden and Finland. This conflict has been the crucial trigger. And as I said, that's one of the reasons I come back to this fundamental point, is that whatever Vladimir Putin was attempting to achieve from this war, it's not quite clear that he's taking away anything except minor pieces of territory in Ukraine, but he's uniting the rest of Europe against him in an unprecedented way.
Does this shift the balance of power in the world in any way, or what are we looking at here? Because had Finland and Sweden been part of NATO before the Ukraine invasion, might it have still gone ahead, do you think, or not? I know it's more like chicken and egg, that maybe the Sweden and Finland thing has happened the other way, but I just wonder if this now means that there is a shift in the power dynamics, even if Russia seems to think that it's getting a foothold in Ukraine.
No, I think if Finland and Sweden were members of NATO, to answer your question directly, before the war, I think Russia still would have gone ahead and invaded Ukraine, simply because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And therein lies perhaps, at least this is what the Ukrainians argue, the fundamental mistake that NATO made in not admitting Ukraine as a member of NATO when it first formally requested it in 2008. At the Bucharest summit of NATO in 2008, the then president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, asked formally for a membership action plan, and instead what he got was a vague promise that Ukraine would join NATO one day. And that was enough to incite Vladimir Putin without offering any real protection to Ukraine. So Ukraine's argument has been all along that had they actually had that protection offered by Article 5 of NATO, which means that an attack on one is an attack on all, if they had that in 2008, Vladimir Putin would never have invaded in 2014, would never have annexed Crimea, and would never have invaded this year. And that's the key kind of counterfactual, or what if. So Finland and Sweden joining, it's symbolically important, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the kind of security architecture, in the sense that NATO is still there, it's still strong. But it's Ukraine not being a member. That was what left it vulnerable to attack.
Professor, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Your insights greatly appreciated. Interesting times that we're living through. Let's see what happens in the next chapter of this unfolding story. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome, Peter.
Thank you. All right, that's Professor Danaka Obachwain speaking to us about the situation in Ukraine and the joining of NATO by Finland and Sweden. Sweden, long time neutral party in all the goings on in Europe, but they've decided to cast their lot with the rest of Eastern Europe, Western Europe.